Good afternoon and welcome to Will Oregon's Drug Decriminalization Experiment Succeed? A webinar hosted by the American Enterprise Institute. A recent referendum, Measure 110, made Oregon the first U.S. state to decriminalize the possession of small amounts of all Schedule 1 through 4 drugs, including heroin, cocaine, methamphetamines, LSD, and MDMA. Instead, such possessions are now civil violations, subject to a $100 fine or health assessment. The move was inspired by a 2001 law in Portugal that removed incarceration as a penalty for drug possession. This referendum came among a broader wave of state and local decisions to decriminalize possession of, and in some instances, legalize, and Bo will talk about the distinction later, certain types of drugs for certain purposes. Here in DC, in the District of Columbia, where I am currently located, for example, Initiative 81, which came into effect this week, has made possession and use of natural psychedelics the DC police's lowest priority, effectively decriminalizing them. Now, what are the goals of the new Oregon law, which is in the process of implementation? Which social, economic, and public health factors should policymakers consider to gauge success? What do possible versions of success look like? What are the risks and uncertainties? There are many aspects to this policy debate, and we have a great panel here that will cover many of them. We will hear what we can learn from the experience with marijuana legalization, from international experiences with decriminalization, and from local first responders. And we'll talk about drug addiction as well as treatment, and we will also discuss the evolving cultural context in which all of these policy debates take place. Now, that's a lot of topics. To cover all of them, we have 5 expert speakers today, a relatively large panel for a broad topic. The first one is Bo Kilmer. He's director of the RAND Drug Policy Research Center at the RAND Corporation, who's going to, in his opening remarks, talk to us about the experience with marijuana that we have had in the United States. Then we will turn to Hannah LeCoeur, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Emergency Medicine at the University of California, Davis. She will talk to us about the Portuguese experience and its relevance to the US situation. We will then turn to Kimberly Hendrickson, who's the director of the Department of Housing, Health, and Human Services in Poulsbo, Washington. Kimberly will talk about decriminalization of drugs and how it affects livability in West Coast cities, and also what decriminalization looks like from the perspective of law enforcement, of the police. I will then turn to my colleague Sally Sattel, who's a resident scholar here at AEI. Sally will talk about the needs of people who are addicted, about controlled drug use versus abuse versus addiction, about the role of course treatment, and what good treatment entails. And then finally, we will also hear from Nick Gillespie, who's editor-at-large at Reason Magazine. And Nick will put all these decisions and developments in the broader cultural context of changing attitudes toward drug liberalization since the 1960s. Now, after that somewhat lengthy introduction, let me first give Bo Kilmer the chance to talk to us about what we've learned from the experience with marijuana legalization and decriminalization. Bo, you want to kick off the panel?
Sure, and good afternoon, everyone. And I want to begin by thanking Stan and Sally and everyone at AEI for putting together such a great panel. I want to do 2 things over the next 5 to 6 minutes. One, make sure that we're all on the same page with respect to terminology. And then I also want to spend a little bit of time talking about the US experience with the decriminalization of cannabis possession. Now, decriminalization and legalization are very different policies. The terms often get used interchangeably, which just creates a lot of confusion. And when we talk about decriminalization, we're typically referring to making possession of small amounts a non-criminal offense. So something which used to be a felony or misdemeanor now becomes something more like a traffic ticket. And when we talk about decriminalization, it usually doesn't refer to the supply side, just possession. Whereas when we talk about legalization, this typically refers to allowing some form of supply, as well as legalizing possession for adults. Once again, that supply component makes it very different. And so we need to be very careful about the words we use when we're talking about these policy changes. And indeed, even when we're talking about reforming drug possession policies, decriminalization is just one example. Now, for example, you could also deprioritize possession offenses, where you wouldn't necessarily change the laws, but the police would just make it a low priority. You've also got pre-booking diversion programs. There's also defelonization, where a penalty can go from being a felony down to a misdemeanor. Or you actually could have legalizing possession just for adults, but still keeping supply prohibited. Now, this is important because there are a lot of different levers here, but still some people just refer to these all as decriminalization, which also creates additional confusion. So as we engage in these discussions, I think it's going to be really important that we be clear about the policy changes that we're discussing. Now, with respect to Oregon, I mean, it's always been on the cutting edge of drug policy. And in fact, Oregon was the first state in the early 1970s to decriminalize the possession of cannabis. Now, the common story is that about a dozen states did this in the 1970s, and then more jumped on board after that. And there were a lot of studies which would compare the decrim states to the non-decrim states. And those early results were really all over the place. And the reason for that is a lot of the early studies didn't correctly define decriminalization. In fact, Rosalie Pakula, who's now at USC, kind of looked at what were typically called the decrim and non-decrim states, and then looked at the actual laws on the books. And it turns out that the quote unquote decriminalized states are not uniquely identifiable based on statutory law, as was presumed by all the researchers. So the bottom line is I wouldn't put much weight on the early studies of cannabis decriminalization in the United States. However, there have been some more recent efforts that have looked at some of the states that had decriminalized cannabis possession since around 2008. And those studies seem to suggest that that decriminalization leads to a large decrease in possession arrests, and there's not much evidence that it actually increases the consumption of cannabis. That said, there was one study that was done about California's decriminalization. And once again, a lot of people think that California decriminalized in the 1970s. That's not the case. California didn't decriminalize the possession of cannabis until 2011. And so this study, which got a lot of attention, showed that after California decriminalized the possession of cannabis, that the past month prevalence for 12th graders increased from 24% to 29%. And the authors concluded that these results provide empirical evidence to support concerns that decriminalization may be a risk factor for future increases in youth marijuana use and acceptance. However, more recently, Greg Majette and Peter Reuter at the University of Maryland published a paper that really challenges findings. First of all, they argued there are other things that could have been happening in California around 2010, 2011, namely all the discussion that was happening around legalization, Proposition 19, which was on the ballot. There was no increase in past month prevalence for the 8th and the 10th graders. And they also kind of look at some other data sources and argue that there's actually better data out there that suggested that the prevalence trend was already increasing before decriminalization happened, really kind of calling these findings into question. Now, one aspect of decriminalization that doesn't get a lot of attention in the US studies is this idea of net widening. Whereas when you reduce the sanctions, does it then end up leading to possibly increased criminal justice interactions? Now, the classic example here in the cannabis space is what happened in South Australia. So in 1987, they implemented something called the Cannabis Expiation Notice System, essentially meaning that if you got caught with a joint or got caught smoking cannabis, instead of them booking you and taking you to the station, they would just give you an on-the-spot fine. And in fact, there turned out over the next 10 years, there was a surge in the number of these fines. It was about 6,000 in 1987, 88, and then it increased to more than 18,000 in 96 and 97. However, research by Eric Single and others said, look, that increase in those fines, it wasn't related to any change in the pattern of cannabis use. They argue that it reflects the greater ease with which police can process minor cannabis offenses and shift away from the use of police discretion in giving offenders informal cautions to a process of formally recording all minor offenses. So whereas before they may have just kind of ignored it, now that since the individuals weren't necessarily going to have an arrest on their record, they were more likely to give a fine. So this is something I think we're going to have to pay close attention to, especially as states like Oregon and others kind of go down this pathway toward decriminalizing possession. Because one of the reasons for doing this is to decrease contact with the criminal justice system. So that's something we're going to want to pay close attention to. So I want to conclude with four points on decriminalization. First, we need to be very careful about extrapolating the US experience with decriminalizing cannabis possession to all other drugs when we're talking about heroin or fentanyl. These are all very different substances, and Oregon is the first state to do this in the US. And while we need to pay close, my second point is while we need to pay close attention to what happens in Oregon, you have to realize it's much more than just decriminalization. You're going to hear about this later on the panel. It's also similar to what Hannah will talk about in Portugal. These reforms weren't just decrim. There was a lot more money going into treatment and outreach, and there were other changes as well. Also, when we talk about decriminalization, got to pay attention to the weight thresholds. That is, what is the amount that's considered a possession offense? And depending on how this is implemented, that's going to have very different implications for people who use drugs as well as people who sell drugs. So this is something we have to pay attention to. And there is some international research on this. And the final point I want to make is that decriminalization doesn't have to be a permanent change. Cautious jurisdictions could, potentially pass this and impose a sunset clause where after X number of years, it would then require the legislature either to decide if they wanted to continue with decriminalization or try something else. Now, this is very different from what we see with the commercial legalization regimes in the United States. So with these private companies making a lot of money and hiring some high-powered lobbyists, if you're a jurisdiction and after you do that 5-10 years down the line, you say, hey, wait, I want to do something different. It's a lot harder to put that genie back in the bottle once you have those commercial interests. Whereas with decriminalization, since it only focuses on possession, you don't have that. And so that is an option that could be considered as jurisdictions are having these discussions. So with that, I will close. I look forward to hearing Hannah talk about Portugal and hearing from the rest of the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Bo. And it's certainly true, of course, that the changes in Oregon involved other aspects of the broader system as well. And in fact, if you look at the official summary of the measure, I don't think the decriminalization aspect even appears in the first half of the little paragraph they give people. Now, to your first concluding point, that it's difficult perhaps to extrapolate from the marijuana experience. I think that's exactly where Hannah can help us out in that the Portuguese experience that you will talk about extends to a broader range of drugs, and just like the Oregon initiative. Hannah, you want to talk to us about that?
Yeah, great. Thanks very much, and really happy to be here. I'm going to talk briefly about Portugal's experience with drug decriminalization. And Portugal's often been cited as an example for the US to emulate in the context of drug reform. I think it's been somewhat misunderstood and overinterpreted. So first, just to be clear, and I think Bo actually made this quite clear, they did not legalize drugs, as has often been loosely suggested. As Bo described, that means they didn't alter the criminal laws prohibiting production and distribution. Users must still depend on the illicit market. So access to drugs didn't change. Portugal's 2001 statute, like Oregon's, removed the possibility of criminal sanction for individuals caught using or in possession of small amounts of all psychoactive drugs. And I think actually the quantities are quite comparable in Oregon and Portugal. So now police issue civil citations, and individuals may be penalized by regional administrative panels that can refer people to drug treatment, hand out fines, revoke professional licenses, or just issue warnings. And while most accounts of Portugal have really focused on decriminalization, as Bo suggested, the reforms also included substantial increases in funding for treatment and other social services. And decriminalization was really part of a broader public health effort, motivated largely by concerns about problem drug use in the country, in particular high rates of heroin use at the time. And so decriminalization was sort of part of this effort to destigmatize addicted users, to focus on treatment rather than punishment. And the administrative commissions were designed to provide a more efficient and effective method for detection and referral to treatment. So what happened in Portugal, and what should we look for and think about in evaluating decriminalization in Oregon? First, just looking at change in sanctions for drug possession. In Portugal, as is the case in Oregon, police continue to serve as the primary source of detection and referral. So they now issue civil citations rather than making arrests. And in the first decade post-reform, civil citations for possession remained roughly comparable in number as to the arrests prior to decriminalization. So unlike the South Australian experience that Bo described, there wasn't a sort of net widening effect in terms of who was getting caught up in the system. In terms of change in sanction, if you look in the years before the reform, essentially no one was actually incarcerated for drug possession. So decriminalization was in many ways a sort of codification of de facto practice. And this is something that we've seen in many US states when they've decriminalized marijuana. Second key question to consider when liberalizing drug policy is what impact will it have on use? In Portugal, there's imperfect causal identification, but I think the bottom line is that drug use didn't change meaningfully following the 2001 law, and nor did indicators of substance use disorder or drug-related deaths. Some early reports suggested that overdose deaths went up, but these reports were looking at raw numbers, and the numbers are dependent on the number of autopsies performed, which also increased in this period. Positive toxicological reports as a percentage of autopsies remained fairly constant. There is data that show major declines in the number of new cases of HIV and AIDS among injecting drug users, and also clear data showing a substantial increase in the availability of treatment. Both the number of treatment centers and the number of individuals receiving treatment increased with the implementation of the 2001 statute. The general drug use didn't increase meaningfully post decriminalization. I think it's not surprising. Again, the law didn't change access to drugs. And as I noted, there wasn't a big change in legal sanction. Almost no one was incarcerated for possession prior to decriminalization. So finally, I'll just close by pointing to the potential sort of broader cultural or symbolic import of decriminalization. I know we're going to talk more about this later as well. One of the things I found studying Portugal was that while arrests for drug trafficking remained roughly the same after the 2001 law, and drug trafficking remained criminal, the number of offenders that were convicted and incarcerated for trafficking fell by close to 50% in the first decade post-reform. And given no change in the legal status of drug production and supply, little change in the composition and volume of arrests for trafficking, these declines in imprisonment appear at least to have been located sort of more in the practices of the criminal courts, and certainly not in the law. And similarly, I think we can see Oregon's new law as part of general shifts that we've seen in US drug policy in recent years, calls to end the war on drugs and racial disparities in drug law enforcement. And so it may have import beyond the sort of practical specifics of drug decriminalization. So I will end there.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Hannah. And we'll talk about that broader cultural context, which obviously doesn't lend itself as well to causal inference, perhaps, as some of the other changes you discussed. We'll talk about that with Nick in a bit. But I want to turn to Kimberly first, who can hopefully tell us a bit about both sort of the broader wraparound systems around drug users, the impact on neighborhoods, on livability, and and also the perspective from law enforcement and first responders. And Kimberly, do you want to go ahead?
Thanks very much for the opportunity to talk about this important issue. As was just mentioned as part of the introduction, I do work with law enforcement throughout the state of Washington. So I've been thinking quite a bit lately about whether Oregon's decriminalization efforts will succeed. When Sally Sattel asked me to be on this panel, I wasn't quite sure what I was going to say, but the last few weeks have given me a very close to home ability to judge this issue, and I've come out of the past few weeks with a much stronger perspective. I live in Washington State, as you know, and on February 25th, our Supreme Court here ruled in a decision called State versus Blake that Washington's state's drug possession law violates the due process clause of both our state constitution and the federal constitution. The Supreme Court ruling comes down to the question of intent and what many people call the not my pants defense, which I'd be happy to elaborate on during Q&A. But the effect of this ruling is a kind of drug decriminalization that goes well beyond the Oregon law that's the topic of this panel today. For example, both Bo and Hannah talked about weight thresholds as an important part of decriminalization considerations. And as you've heard, in Oregon, small amounts of drugs are subject to civil penalty. In Washington state, thanks to the recent Blake decision, there is no clear legal distinction between possessing a small and a not so small quantity of drugs. And according to some interpretations, at the moment, there is no amount of drug possession that can be punished by civil or criminal penalty. In Oregon, as has already been mentioned, there's a plan, albeit largely unrealized at this point, to connect people who are charged with possession with some sort of care and treatment. There is no nexus in Washington state between possession and treatment under the Blake decision. And indeed, the decision is causing people to be removed from treatment programs. That last bit of information is so striking, I think I'd like to elaborate on it for a moment. The ruling in Blake applies retroactively. Let that sink in for a second, which means that people with charges, warrants, sentences, and probation obligations stemming from possession charges from months and years ago have grounds to challenge them at the moment in Washington, or charges and sentences are being automatically dismissed. This also means that people who are engaged in court-ordered treatment stemming from a possession charge no longer have any obligation to continue in these treatment programs. And indeed, in Washington state, we are now in the utterly bizarre situation of kicking people out of drug court even when they want to stay. So my short answer to Sally's question and the question of this panel is that Oregon's decriminalization effort may well succeed because it's much more sensible than what we're doing in Washington state. What I'd like to do then with my few remaining minutes is just talk a bit about decriminalization from a police officer's perspective. I am not a police officer. I don't represent police officers, but I have worked closely with officers for the past few years, designing and managing programs to help them better respond to individuals with substance use disorder issues and mental illness, sometimes co-occurring. I currently work for the city of Poulsbo, as Stan mentioned, but I also do consulting work for the Lead Support Bureau to help communities implement law enforcement assisted diversion throughout Washington state. And I'm a chair of an association that includes members that engage in co-response programs throughout the state as well. That's the partnering of police with behavioral health specialists. It is so interesting and unfortunate to me that we don't talk about decriminalization from the police perspective. We talk a lot about it, about what police do, but very rarely about what police think, because they have such a unique point of view on decriminalization. The police perspective is interesting because it comes from seeing what happens when drug use moves from being an issue of personal choice to a very public issue of how that personal choice affects other people. In the police officer's world, drug use is all about externalities. The individual who overdoses and needs teams of responders to revive him, the people whose use causes them to act erratically and to frighten people away from public places, the addicts who smash car windows and break into homes in order to fund their habit. I am personally very attractive to Professor Carl Hart's argument that most drug users are not addicts and most are in control of their behavior, but the police perspective is focused on the damage and heartache and violence caused by that smaller number of drug users who are not. To quote a sergeant I know and respect very much on Bainbridge Island, we fought the drug war and the drugs won. There is an overwhelming sentiment from the officers that I know that drugs destroy people, marriages, families, neighborhoods, and decriminalization is just another way we are failing as a society to deal with this problem. Let me get a little more specific though about officer objections to decriminalization, at least how this is unfolding in Washington. First, officers dislike the arbitrariness and ambiguity of the new decriminalization rules. And of course, in Washington, this is the inevitable result when criminal law is radically changed by 5 Supreme Court justices overnight. For officers on the street, there are a multitude of open questions about what officers can do, when they can arrest, what they can do with something, even if possession is legal. Are they able to confiscate drugs, a whole host of questions, and a feeling that rules have been changed without their input being considered. It's probably important to point out that West Coast decriminalization is happening at a time where it's quite fashionable in some quarters, in some cities, to question and criticize police and encouraging their dismantling and defunding. Officers that I know see decriminalization as a poorly conceived idea that's either dismissive to their point of view or hostile to their profession. I don't agree with that perspective, but I completely understand it. Decriminalization in law enforcement feels like another message that their efforts and expertise are not valued. Second reason officers dislike decriminalization has nothing to do with our current culture wars and how it feels to do policing. It's far more personal. For many officers, decriminalization is a bad idea because it takes away their ability to persuade and coerce individuals that they care about to start a recovery program. It's a very common occurrence, at least with the officers that I have the privilege of working with, that arrest or the threat of arrest is used as an entry point into services, or that charges are sent up to a prosecutor with the hope that somehow they'll resort in court-mandated treatment. People on this panel, people listening at home might dismiss this concern, and I understand, but in my experience, it's very sincere and it's very rooted in on the street, day after day human experience. Some people, definitely not all people, actually respond well to sanction or the threat of sanction. And that doesn't mean that criminal sanction and the threat of sanction is the only way to shepherd people into treatment, but it's an important consideration. So in my final moments here, if the question is, will decriminalization in Oregon succeed? I would say I'm not ready to answer that question, but I know that it won't if officers are seen as part of the problem of substance abuse instead of part of the solution. And I'm quite sure that it won't if sanction is taken off the table as part of recovery efforts. There's parts of the Oregon law that I like very much. There's elements of it that suggest the importance of first responders as a part of a public health response and the role that sanction might be able to play to shepherd some people into care and treatment. But I really think those are the elements that are going to be needed to be developed, as well as accessibility to care and services in order for the law to succeed. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Kimberly, and I am delighted that you ended on that topic, because that gives us a very natural bridge to Sally Sittel, who will talk to us about treatment, about sort of distinction between controlled use, abuse, and addiction, and also I think the role that that force and the threat of the criminal justice system can play in getting people into treatment. Sally, do you want to take it away?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, when I think, as a psychiatrist, really, when I think of the folks who are going to be the target of this new law and for whom it's really been created, they fall into three general categories. The first is what I call the controlled user. In fact, Kim already alluded to such a controlled user who's gotten a lot of attention lately, Professor Carl Hart at Columbia, who wrote a book called Drug Use for Grown-Ups. And he came completely out of the closet, that's his term, in identifying himself as someone who uses, for example, heroin on a, sounds like a probably weekly basis, and other drugs. And while this is very surprising to a number of folks, it reflects reality. These drugs, even the most feared drugs, can be used in a controlled manner. I mean, that just is a fact. Now, that kind of use is rarely studied, and such people, if they're otherwise grown-ups, as Carl identifies himself, meaning these are people who can control their impulses, delay gratifications, soothe their own emotions. In other words, just the kinds of qualities that, if they're missing, are a setup to become addicted to drugs. These people don't come to attention. They're kind of hidden. So we don't have a good sense of how common this is, but I feel that it probably represents the majority of people who are involved with drugs. Now, if such a person, such a controlled user is apprehended in Oregon, he will pay, or I'm just going to use he, but he will pay this $100 fine. And that will be it. If he doesn't have the $100, I suppose he can just, you have 6 weeks after, I'm using the word apprehension, I'm not even sure if that's the right term, but after somehow this individual comes to the attention of law enforcement, he has 6 weeks to present himself at what's called some sort of evaluation center, and they will determine whether or not he is a controlled user or an abuser, which is the next category I'm going to discuss, or someone who's addicted, which is the third of the 3 categories. So that's a controlled user, someone who can control his drug use, just like most of us can control our alcohol consumption. A person who was a problem user, a drug abuser, that used to be a diagnosis in the DSM. Now we call folks who have drug problems substance use disorder. It comprises 11 criteria, and if you meet up until about 8 of those, you can either be considered a mild or a moderate. You can either be considered to have a mild or moderate disorder, and that's where problem use would probably fall. The idea of being a substance abuser or someone with a mild to moderate substance use disorder is that you would use with, some frequency, maybe once a week, maybe once a month, maybe every few months. And some of those times you would get into trouble. You would either make the bad decision to drive. You might do it on a day where you just have to sleep it off and you're neglecting your kids that day. You might miss work, get into debt, or even take too much and overdose, not necessarily die, please, but overdose. These are problems. So that's problem use. And that is a problem. That is not addiction, however. And I will describe that. Addiction as a third of the 3 general categories would be someone who feels a compulsion to use daily, finds it difficult to stop, may or may not be interested in quitting, and chances are may have significant comorbidity with mental illness. And there are different responses to these, clinical responses to these folks. Someone with controlled use, basically, I would frankly have nothing to say to, except why are you getting yourself into a position where you are picked up? Just be more careful. If this is your lifestyle choice, not approving, disapproving, if that's your choice, be wiser about it. If you are someone who's abusing drugs, a lot of these folks can stop on their own. Most people, frankly, do when there's some consequence in their personal life. The wife says she's going to leave, the kids are disappointed, the boss gets angry, and they can take care of the problem on their own. Now, as a psychiatrist, I might ask the person why they're so intent on sabotaging themselves, but that requires a person to be interested in that question, and that would just be a topic for psychotherapy. But again, that's not someone who that's someone who might benefit from therapy, but don't think that's who we're often thinking about when we think about drug treatment, who is the addicted individual. Now, this person can go to an evaluation within his 6 weeks, and he can just walk out. He takes he gets all the questions asked. He probably takes a urine test. I'm not sure if they do. But he can be told, yes, you have a severe drug problem. You rate 11 of 11 on the substance use disorder scale in the DSM, and the person can just walk out. And that's a problem. It's also a problem to me if he has 6 weeks to show up, because remember, fentanyl is very dangerous and people typically don't go out of their way to use it. It's 50 times the potency of heroin, about 100 times the potency of morphine. It's what's causing the peak. We've never seen such high mortality in drug use, and it's due to fentanyl. People can buy pills thinking it's oxycodone or Xanax, but it's fentanyl that's pressed into pill form. Fentanyl can dust the cocaine that they get. So 6 weeks can be a long time to be out there with these drugs. So that's one thing to keep in mind. The other is that A lot of people who have a serious drug problem, first, I'm not sure they'd even keep their evaluation appointment, but they're often not very interested in drug treatment, or they're very ambivalent. If they do enter, the dropout rates are significant, about 50% within 3 to 6 months. Now, that again is a problem. And the treatment is different depending on whether the person is abusing opioids or stimulants. Psychedelics are not addictive, so that's, since not that kind of an issue. And people don't necessarily have to be an inpatient. But when heroin or opioids are the problem, we have a better way of helping people stand still more quickly by using medications that effectively replace them, such as methadone or buprenorphine. We also want to do, if they're interested, and we hope they are, relapse prevention therapy, which is a kind of cognitive behavioral intervention, family therapy, social support, hopefully job training. Stimulants, there are no medications, but there is contingency management, which is basically a token system where people get rewarded for doing well. It could be actually in the form of a gift card from McDonald's or Walgreens, this kind of thing. Lots of research on contingency management, very, very promising. But the thing that's so ironic, and what Kim alluded to, is that patients' ambivalence about getting into treatment and staying there were actually addressed by drug courts and other diversion programs under the law. Not everyone who came under the umbrella of a diversion program necessarily has to be in treatment. A good example was a Hawaii program called HOPE, Hawaii Opportunity Probation and Enhancement, where just contingencies were used on an outpatient basis and without any treatment, formal treatment at all. And that's great for some category. That might be good for people who are abusers, drug abusers. Drug courts could be very promising with rearrest reductions of 30 to 50% within a year. Ideally, and in most places, I believe the criminal record can be expunged, and that is critical. And they kept people in treatment longer. And it is a well-known fact in the drug treatment world that the longer you stay, the better you do. You eventually internalize the values of the system. You realize life is cleaner, life is better. You're flourishing more when you are drug-free. And that leverage will be lost. So let me finish by the things I would want people to look for in terms of whether this will be a success. Of course, who can answer this at this time? One is recruitment. Will people use more drugs if they don't have to worry about a criminal record? I suppose there are two questions. Will the individuals who are using drugs use more, or will we recruit new users? There's a tacit sense, of course, of that maybe use isn't so bad if we're going to decriminalize it. I don't know the answer. I'm a little skeptical it might, and we might see what happened in Portugal, but I don't know. And if so, will there be more people having more bad trips, more visits to the ER, more fatal and non-fatal overdoses? Will more people enter drug treatment? Oddly, and this is one red flag to me, the treatment capacity in Oregon, even though the law was enacted on February 1st, or implemented, I should say, on February 1st, the treatment system doesn't have to be up and running till October 1st. Obviously, there's a treatment infrastructure already there, but it was supposed to be expanded. So kind of not ready for that. And it seems to me if you're going to do anything to liberalize drug use, you want to make it safer to do so. And again, that's where harm reduction and more treatment come in. Also, and finally, I'm actually concerned about the psychedelic picture, because psychedelics are now becoming probably one of the hottest things in psychiatry in a very constructive way. I mean, these medications or these drugs will soon probably become medications because pharmaceutical companies have taken a significant interest in them, will have significant therapeutic value. And if there is sloppy use, unguarded use, use without trip sitters, guides, this kind of thing, we could go right back to where we were in the 60s, where there was abuse, where there were some of the some of the coverage was frankly not accurate. For example, Art Linklater's daughter did not walk out a window because she was on LSD, but that became enshrined in the public memory, along with many other incidents where psychedelics were involved. And this is a great opportunity for my field to expand the therapeutic spectrum. And I hope this is an opportunity that we don't blow in DC as well.
Yeah, my homeland of the Netherlands had saw a surge in consumption of psychedelics in the 90s, early 2000s, and that ultimately led to a ban. And so that I guess is not a super promising example. Let's turn to Nick, who or so we have promised will provide us with a broader cultural picture of everything that has happened since the 1960s, as well as addressing Hannah's question about the broader cultural impact of these kinds of decriminalization efforts, if you wish.
Yeah, thanks very much. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I want to thank Stan and especially Sally for both putting this panel together and making the mistake of including me on it. And I also want to talk about AEI. This is a great place to be talking about changes to the drug war. I can remember attending a panel back in 2005, I believe it was, with David Boyum and Peter Reuter, where they had published through AEI, widely understood as a conservative right of center think tank. And this was in the throes of the Bush ascendancy and what people mistakenly called the permanent Republican majority in government. They published a study about the cost benefits of the war on drugs, and they concluded that the benefits were severely overwhelmed by the costs of the drug war on every possible level. And I thought it was a great thing to see AEI, which is also interested in good governance as well as limited government, to kind of be in the foreground of that. It's also auspicious to be talking about this now with Joe Biden in the White House. More than any single politician in America over the past half decade, he is the architect. He is the he's the marshal of the Marshall Plan of the drug war. He was there at almost every major increase in the stupidity of what I would consider certainly the stupidity of the drug war, not just simply in its goals, but its implementation. So it's great to be part of this, and it's great that AEI is continuing to really lead in a significant way in talking about things that matter. What we've already seen in the discussion is that most of when people talk about decriminalization programs, they talk about them as successes if drug use doesn't increase, which is kind of a weird measure of success, but it's interesting, and it seems to be a broadly kind of observed pattern that the legal regime does not necessarily indicate, that's not the most important thing in whether or not people are using particular drugs. At Reason 25 years ago, something like that, I remember quoting a RAND study that was fascinating about international drug use patterns, and they found essentially, I forget the authors now, but they found essentially no correlation between the drug regime and drug use of citizens in a particular jurisdiction. So you had places where there were very strict drug laws and a lot of drug use, which is kind of the United States, or where there were strict drug laws but very little drug use, where there were lax laws and very little drug use, et cetera. And so it's a widely observed pattern that drug laws, it's kind of like immigration laws, they don't really dictate the behavior of people at the end. And I think that's worth keeping in mind. But I expect, on a certain set of parameters that will measure the success or failure of drug decriminalization in Oregon if we don't see massive spikes in all sorts of antisocial or negative outcomes, like there are not a lot of new or a spike in overdoses, a massive increase in use, and things like driving while intoxicated or driving under the influence and things like that. And I think some of the panelists have already talked to that. Will substance use disorder diagnoses go up? And then also, can we factor those out by, it might be that people are more willing to enter treatment when there's no longer a criminal component or anything like that hanging over the head, but things like that. But what I would like to do is also kind of suggests a different metric for success in Oregon, which is, will people after 6 months, after a year, after a couple of years, will people be using a wider range of intoxicants or substances, or, you know, whether we want to call them illicit drugs or psychotherapeutics? Will they be using a wider range of substances in order to kind of get through their daily lives, whether they're using drugs to feel good, to avoid things, to treat depression, to increase productivity at work, to enhance relationships? According to the National Survey of Drug Use and Health, the latest edition in 2019, for past month drug use among people 12 years and older, the percentage of people who said they used illicit drugs in the past months was 13%. The number of people who used alcohol in the past month was 51%. For me, one of the metrics of success will be actually as if alcohol use goes down and that illicit drug use figure goes up, and the categories within that, which is overwhelmingly marijuana, is really almost the only significant drug in terms of percentage or use that gets used by people. But will people be using less marijuana and maybe more ketamine? Will people be using a little bit more psychedelics, whether it's ecstasy or whether it's mushrooms, which of course have also been put into a new category in Oregon in a way that'll be fascinating to see if that law can even come to any kind of fruition, given the weirdness of, in 2 years' time, I guess, in Oregon, you'll be able to legally use magic mushrooms in a government place, which is kind of like, your parents finally saying, okay, you can use any drug you want, but you have to do it in the basement. It's an odd program, but I'm interested to see what happens with that. But for me, the range of how people use drugs is going to be one of the markers of success or of interest in the Oregon experience. We take for granted the idea of individual choice in almost all aspects of our lives as a good thing. It's better that we have more ways of working, we have more ways of being married, we have more ways of eating and choosing from a wide variety of foods, because these markets have been deregulated or liberalized, whether through custom or through law and things like that. I think we should bring that question to bear on drug decriminalization and ultimately on legalization, because as everybody's kind of pointed out, that drug decriminalization doesn't change supply, and it's also not clear that it will actually increase, that any of these substances will increase. I think, I think that's an important question to ask, and to get to that larger point about what are the larger cultural contexts. If you go back to the late 60s, and I'm happy to talk more about this at length in the question and answer period, Gallup found, it was something like 7, 8, 9% of people around 1969, 1970 were in favor of legalizing marijuana. And, and nobody, almost, with the exception of a couple of crazy hippies and Harvard dropouts, were interested in legalizing psychedelics, which had only recently been, of course, banned. But now it's 66%. It's 3/4, 2/3, 3/4 of Americans are ready for marijuana legalization. They support it. In states where it's being used, it's clearly being used largely as a substitute for alcohol and for other intoxicants. We have gone through a massive revolution over the past couple of decades in America, where because we are the pharmacopoeia, the drugs that we get prescribed to manage our moods, to manage our productivity, to enhance our lives, to make our lives richer, better, more functional, has just exploded. And as a result, everybody is much more comfortable with the idea of using drugs first and foremost, which is kind of fascinating, but also kind of picking and choosing among the drugs that work for us. And I think it's very interesting. I've long been an advocate of kind of trying to imagine what a post-prohibitionist America would look like, not necessarily because all people should use drugs or all people want to use drugs, but rather that when we get rid of prohibition, we can have much more interesting and fruitful conversations where people are not demonized, or in worst case scenarios, put in jail or denied treatment and an ability to come forward and deal with their problems with substance abuse. But in a post-prohibition America, And we're getting there. We're in the beginning stages of this. We will be taking for granted that we will all be using drugs. I was just rereading something by William Burroughs, who is probably not the greatest person to cite in any drug policy discussion, but he talked about how, the vision of a drug-free America is an insane, dreary prospect because we're always using drugs. The question is whether or not they're legal, what is the social context of them, not the morality of using substances to change how we think and who we are and how we feel, how we love, how we work, all of that. And I think that is the big question in front of us. And I think the Oregon drug decriminalization effort will be very interesting for me, and it will be a success if actually when we look back in a year's time and we find people in Oregon maybe drinking less and maybe using magic mushrooms a little bit more, or using, whatever substance they find helps them become more self-actualized at lower social cost to other people. So I'll stop there.
Excellent, Nick. Thank you very much. I wanted to, before I mix in some audience questions, I wanted to make sure that all the panelists have the opportunity to attack each other if they so desire, especially, I guess, Bo and Hannah, because you guys spoke earlier on. If there's anything you'd like to respond to, now would be a good moment for that. Bo, you want to go ahead?
No, I think the one thing about Oregon is it's going to be really interesting to see how this plays out with respect to treatment utilization, right? Because as Sally mentioned, on one hand, you're going to be reducing criminal justice referrals, but then on the other, there's an argument that if decriminalization actually does reduce the stigma associated with using these substances, people may be more likely to talk about their drug use, maybe more likely to ask for help. These health assessments, they can't force anyone to go into treatment, but they can make referrals. So, on that hand, you can imagine that it could actually potentially increase the uptake. But, the devil's really going to be in the details here. Essentially, what Measure 110 did is it creates this whole separate accountability council. And this council is going to decide how the funding is spent, how much is going to go to treatment, how much is going to go to wraparound services. And they just had their first meeting, I think, at the beginning of February. And so there's a lot of work. It sounds like they're going to delay things. So whereas before they were going to have these addiction recovery centers set up by October 1st of this year, I think that's getting pushed back to 2022 because they realize they're going to need more time. So right now, if you don't pay the $100 fine, you can then make a phone call to get the health assessment. And also the other thing with respect to treatment is, a lot of the, not all of the money, but a good chunk of the money for this is going to be coming from cannabis tax revenues that Oregon's getting. But some of those revenues right now are already being used for funding treatment. So it's kind of unclear how that's all going to play out. So once again, the key takeaway from my 5-minute spiel was, look, this is a lot more than just decriminalization. So when we begin, in a couple of years, when the evaluations come out, we want to be very careful about distinguishing, well, what was because of the change in the possession law versus how much was attributable to changes in resources for funding, for treatment, harm reduction, and outreach.
I have an audience question that's in a somewhat similar vein from Amy Ronshausen, who asks, and I think maybe Bo or Hannah can provide some insight on this. So she says, what about depenalization versus decriminalization? Changing the penalties to offer alternatives to incarceration, but there would still be involvement with the criminal justice system. Are there any studies comparing these two policies, right? So that involves a little more coercion, I guess, than decriminalization, and addresses what Kimberly mentioned too, right? That you have that way of forcing people into treatment. Are you aware of any evidence on that kind of approach? Hannah?
So I'm not. Now we're back to Bo's initial point about different terms. I think of depenalization as a sort of de facto version of decriminalization, where you're sort of not enforcing the penal law. And if that were the case, then you wouldn't sort of have the.
No. So here, what the person asking the question means clearly is, either there's incarceration or there's treatment, and those are
So sort of drug court model.
Yeah.
Is that the idea?
I think so.
So I don't know, both, specific.
Yeah, I mean, there've been a number of states that have had initiatives where they're trying to offer alternatives to incarceration, including, referrals to treatment. California had Proposition 36, which wasn't necessarily putting people in drug courts. One of the issues with that they ran into in California is that individuals, they were being referred to treatment, but they never ended up going. And so finally, it wasn't until, I forget when Schwarzenegger did this, finally the treatment folks as well as the law enforcement folks, they ended up passing a law, which essentially would allow for flash incarceration. So it says, look, we're giving you this option to you, to go to treatment. If you're not even going to go, then, we have this ability to put you in jail for a day or two, and as a way to kind of show you, hey, we're taking this seriously. So this passed. However, it was challenged by those who had kind of written and advocated for this ballot initiative, because with ballot initiative, we could have a whole separate discussion about ballot initiatives in California. But long story short, the legislature can't pass something that would be, kind of violate the spirit of that. And indeed, the court came down and ruled and said, no, that this law that was signed to allow for flash incarceration was actually against the spirit of what the initiative was trying to do, and deemed it unconstitutional. Yeah. And so, one thing about what will be different about Oregon is Oregon's not forcing anyone to go into treatment. So you won't necessarily have, that kind of lingering. And I believe, Hannah, I think you've done more work on this than anyone else. It's in Portugal, they can refer you to treatment, but if you don't go, really nothing happens, right?
Right. No, there isn't a sort of, exactly. They can fine you, they can refer you, but there isn't a sort of hammer at the end. And as Bo, you pointed out, it is, they did invest a lot sort of financially in treatment. So actually sort of teasing apart, we know the number of treatment centers, the number of people in treatment went up, whether that's just because of the expansion of services or because of the sort of destigmatization. It's really hard to sort out. But yes, there isn't the sort of same leverage you might get in a drug court. But as Bo said, there's also less stigma. And I think, another just sort of interesting thing that I think happens with drug courts and actually in the commissions in Portugal as well is that, there's some amount, not everyone that's caught using or in possession of drugs, and this sort of speaks to Sally's point, has substance use disorder or is a drug addict. And so, it's not, for some people, treatment is really the right answer, but it isn't for everyone. In Portugal, the people sort of just going before the commissions, it was about 50% were cannabis users in the beginning. And within 10 years, it was about 75%. And those are people that just got issued warnings and nothing else really happened. And probably the composition changed just because of changing patterns of drug use in the country. But, and you could also say that they were sort of useful. The commissions were useful in sort of finding the people that really needed treatment and not worrying about those who didn't. But I think it's just sort of important to keep in mind in terms of sort of leverage and excuse me. No, go ahead.
I was going to say there's also a little bit of a stress test built into this in a way, in the sense of weeding out the people with the true drug problems, in the sense that you'll end up committing a crime at some point. You're not going to, excuse me, and then you're shoplifting, this kind of thing. And if you don't want to go to treatment, but you keep getting arrested and keep getting fined, and then you will end up in a drug court. And Oregon should have pretty good drug courts because they started them in 1993. They've been doing them for almost 30 years. The first one was 1989 in Miami. So in a sense, Oregon really has an array now of kind of an interesting spectrum of approaches from drug courts to now this decriminalization model.
Kimberly, I saw you raise your hand.
Yeah, thanks, Stan. I just wanted to jump in with a more maybe boots on the ground practical perspective on the question about depenalization and court-ordered diversion treatment programs. I think one of the most valuable lessons I've learned from working with law enforcement is there is no one single approach that works. And some of the frustration coming from first responders are some of these court-ordered programs. I don't want to pick on drug court, but pretrial diversion, drug court, mandatory treatment as a condition for a furlough. Oftentimes these services are woefully insufficient, and they don't match the needs of the participants. And as Sally has mentioned, they're often just not very effective. So I just want to jump in to say that I think maybe some of the frustration that I'm hearing from first responders about decriminalization is because the treatment options are so bad. And if I remember correctly from the Oregon legislation, they rank very close to the bottom of the nation in terms of available services. I hope at some point that these conversations about decriminalization and depenalization focus a little bit less on the criminal justice side and a little bit more about the need for more effective options, which incidentally don't always include treatment. I'm really proud to work for the Law Enforcement Assisted Diversion Bureau, whose one of their major contributions to this debate, I think, have been showing the importance of addressing the non-treatment needs of drug users and the importance of addressing underlying issues such as, poverty and housing and access to social services, and a harm reduction approach that can lead to a treatment program, but often can just help stabilize people to the point that they reduce their behavior that affects others and themselves in a negative way. So that's a lot for one comment. I just would like to talk more about the frustrations that many of us have with treatment options and the hope that maybe we could broaden that discussion to talk about other things.
Yeah, so it does relate directly to a block of questions we've gotten that maybe Nick won't like on what kind of policies reduce drug use. Is there evidence that decriminalization in Portugal or elsewhere reduce drug use? And sort of on the flip side, is there research on the impact of decriminalization on perceptions of harm? So if that whole block, what happens to use depending on the legal and cultural context, right? If you're worried that treatment options are never going to be particularly, like, obviously we can imagine a world with better treatment options, I suppose. But if you think that's not happening, then maybe use, or at least harm reduction approaches should receive at least some attention. So does anyone have particularly strong views on that type of questions, that type of approach?
Well, what I've seen in my personal experience, Dan, is that what seems to work as if the one theme that I keep following is that if you give people personalized, individual-centered attention through intensive case management, and you actually take the time and they have the ability to stick with people and figure out, what they need to get out of whatever destructive cycle they're in, it helps a lot better than a checkbox on a court form that orders somebody to a particular kind of treatment. So
I see.
I support personalized approaches that are focused on variation.
I see. And I see. So an entirely different block of policies, of course, focuses on the supply side of the market, right? And not to be the economist here, but obviously, you can just drive up the costs of supply, drive up the costs that suppliers face, drive up prices, and reduce use levels that way. Now, that also, of course, comes at tremendous cost, but we have received a number of questions about this, and some of them, I think, correctly focus. For example, Michael Barton says, isn't it incoherent to decriminalize, meaning I can have and use the drug, but you can go to prison for selling it to me? And there does seem to be something to that. Similarly, Gordon Taylor asks, without supplying a source of safe pharmaceutical grade drugs, especially heroin, at a competitive price, can this legislation substantially reduce overdose death rates? And so, right, so there's a whole range of issues on the supply side that we haven't really discussed today, right? Obviously, in part because that's not what the Oregon legislation is about. But where do you guys see that kind of policies going? What's the end game there? Of course, if you in a sense, if you reduce restrictions on supply, prices are going to go down and use are going to go up, right? I'd say that's the first order effect. That may not be a concern if you believe that most use is responsible and not, doesn't end up in abuse and addiction. But I do think that is what has people concerned about loosening restrictions on that side of the market. Anyone want to take on that question?
If I may, I mean,
Yeah.
this question of supply, we have, going back to the early 70s, we have a long record of drug prices and the potency of them. And no matter how much interdiction was tried, drug prices tended to come down overall in inflation adjusted terms. Potency and purity got better. This is, the interdiction does not work on its own terms. And
you would say, and I think it's fair to say, it's hard to imagine it's hard to imagine even more effort going into raising the cost of production and distribution.
And as an added thing, then you get a substitution effect. And this is something I think Sally's work has really pointed out, both, particularly the writings that she's done about Appalachia, Ohio. OxyContin comes into a market and that into a place, and that creates a market. When that gets dried up because of various policies that are somewhat effective in squeezing down supply or ease of access, something else comes up. And in fact, OxyContin was a substitute for previous certain types of substances. In a broader sense, though, I think the questions that we're asking here, and I understand why they're focused on people who are dysfunctional drug users. Either they have large problems with being able to use on a regular basis, or they're actual addicts and need real interventions. That isn't what's driving. I don't think that's what drove the decriminalization efforts or the legalization of psilocybin in Oregon, or is changing things in DC, or recreational legal marijuana throughout the country. It is this broad-based shift from a culture which was terrified of drugs, or terrified of certain drugs because they had been successfully identified with Blacks, in the 20s, with Mexicans in the 30s, with hippies in the 60s, with ravers in the 80s. You can go on and on. There has been this massive cultural shift that needs to be understood, because that's what's driving policy and public opinion on this, which is that we are much more comfortable. We are a more mature society when it comes to using intoxicants or other agents in order to achieve the end states that we want. And I interviewed yesterday for Reason. I interviewed Stuart Brand, who's a legendary figure in the last 60 years of American culture. He was a merry prankster, with Ken Kesey in the 60s. He founded the Whole Earth Catalog in the late 60s, which its opening credo was, "We are as gods and we better get good at it." He was talking about technology. He was talking about computers. He was talking about drug use. We are as gods. And what has happened over the past half century is that people recognize that we like to use substances to supplement our consciousness, and we better get good at it. And I think decriminalization is one step towards that. But if we only talk about it and its effects on either addicts or on criminal justice or on first responders, we're not going to be kind of addressing where the society is headed and why we're even talking about these things in the first place.
Does anyone want to add to that? Otherwise, one question that is somewhat related to these cultural developments is something I've wondered about, which is, why do so many of these changes come through initiatives and referenda? We've seen that in many states, and obviously it's certainly not an ideal way to make policy, whether whether you're broadly supportive of the substantive changes or not, right? I think there's, as Sally pointed out, it's not totally clear what the timeline is for the rollout of the various changes in Oregon. Obviously, Kimberly's discussion of events in Washington State, which went through the judicial channel, which is obviously also not the ideal way to go about this, hint at the same problem. Why is this? Why aren't legislators making these changes? Poll numbers seem very strong, certainly for marijuana. Do you guys have a sense of what's happening there? Is it just too much work? Is it too risky? Is that, what's going on?
Bo, did you want to? I'll go.
Yeah, I'll just say, I mean, early on, the voters are ahead and the politicians don't want to deal with the risk. I mean, we saw this with medical cannabis, right? Starting with California in 96. The first few states to do this all did this through the ballot initiative process. As the stigma decreased and it became less of a political liability, you then saw state legislatures engaging more in these discussions, and you saw bills being passed through the traditional process. Same thing with a recreational cannabis legalization, right? The early states did this, and then you had Illinois and then Vermont. And I suspect, look, I mean, discussions in, it just passed, I think, both houses in Virginia. So, I think it takes a while. And I think we're going to see the same thing with respect to decriminalizing possession of all drugs. I wouldn't be surprised if we saw similar ballot initiatives in other states. And then potentially over time, I can imagine seeing more state legislators kind of dealing with this.
What do you think on of policy on the supply side front? Do you think that will just follow gradually afterwards?
You mean legalizing all drugs?
No, production.
Legalizing production and sales. Yeah. That's a whole separate discussion. I think the takeaway there, and this is something I've done a lot of research on cannabis legalization. There are a lot of different ways to legalize cannabis. In the United States, we're basically focused on this for-profit commercial model. Go outside of the United States, there's a lot more interest in the nuance. Even parts of Canada, you've got government stores, grow your own. And, it seems to me what we see with cannabis, I mean, if we were going to go down this path for cocaine and for heroin, it's hard to imagine that not being a kind of another for-profit model, which comes with advertising, comes with a lot of other issues. My sense is that, as discussions about legalizing supply, get more serious, my sense again is that outside of the United States, there's going to be a much more kind of nuanced discussion about this. But I think, look with big pharma, tobacco. I think we're a ways away before having serious discussions about legalizing the supply. It's not like cannabis you can grow in your backyard here. If you want to get cocaine, you want to get heroin, that's a lot harder to get and produce within states.
There are, I'll add something else. One is that we have a gerontocracy in America. I mean, this is most clear, at the federal level, where I think the combined age of the presidential candidates, nominees of the Democratic and Republican Party was like 150 years old. Donald Trump was the first major party candidate, full nominee to actually say that he would legalize or he would deschedule pot if Congress passed a law. So, but Joe Biden is still kind of hedging on this type of thing. But more importantly, at the federal level, Congress has completely, over the past 20 years, has abdicated almost all of its legislative power and would rather, kind of explain away a bad executive order or an executive action. Something like that is happening at the state level. Arizona in 1996, the same year that California overwhelmingly supported medical marijuana, they passed a far more radical ballot initiative, which said that a doctor could prescribe, or write a recommendation for any substance, legal or illegal, as long as they pointed to a journal article that supported it. It passed overwhelmingly. It was something like 2/3 of the vote. The state legislature vetoed it. They vetoed it, and they took it to the Supreme Court, which also overturned it. And it took Arizona another, 25 years to get back to just legalizing pot. But part of the reason is the gerontocracy. Older people, even though they're probably more likely, drug use in a lot of ways for a lot of illicit substances peaked in 1979, 1980. But younger people, even if they're using drugs at lower rates than their elders, are more comfortable with it, but they're not the ones in power. And then when you look at the established interests, just from a public choice economics point of view, big liquor, and big pharma is not interested in, ceding ground to new territories any more than record companies were happy to see streaming services come around, or Hollywood was interested in letting VCR manufacturers come in and take some of their territory. So there are, and then you throw in all the police unions, the prison building unions, teachers, There's an entire infrastructure. The war on drugs has to be understood as something like the Cold War, where it is not simply about in one explicit area of life. It is shot through every aspect of American life. And even if most of us don't believe the war on drugs is worth the costs, figuring out, like even understanding all of the ways that it affects every policy level, every area of our lives will take a long time. And there are a lot of arrayed interests against any kind of change.
Thank you, Nick. I saw Kimberly raise her hand. We're about done here, so I want to give everyone the opportunity to deliver a last few words, if so desired. Kimberly, do you want to go first?
Just a quick reaction to Nick. I really am in strong agreement that the trends are moving in the direction that he's indicating, but I just would like to point out the importance of counter reactions. Here in Washington State, we're seeing something that I never thought we'd see, which is localities considering the recriminalization of drugs in the light of the Blake decision. So yes, Nick, you're right. The world is turning your way. However, it's interesting how smaller communities outside of urban areas that distinguish themselves by their differences to places like Seattle or Portland or Olympia might have more impact in this debate than you might originally think. And
that's certainly the case in the Netherlands, where there's a huge divide between a couple of urban centers and the rest of the country. Yep. I agree. And I also agree with your point, when you have laws being created, whole cloth by ballot initiative, or I think in a less positive way by the courts, you invite this type of thing. These need to be participatory changes in custom and in law, and they haven't been, and that's going to cause as many problems as it might address.
Yeah, much of the pushback in the Netherlands comes from communities close to the borders, obviously. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Kimberly, sorry.
Just thanking Nick, I very much appreciate his comments, and in my final comments, I would just say I hope we get to a point where we can all join hands and realize that the war on drugs was a complete and utter failure. But going to the other extreme and saying that sanction altogether doesn't work to address some of the issues caused by the externalities of abusive and damaging drug use is not a great solution either. Look forward to being a part of more panels like this where we can find some sort of middle way that can bring the benefits of the last few decades of experience. Thank you.
Yeah. And the way to do it is experimentation and local control, I think.
Thanks, Ellie. Any other closing thoughts?
Oh, if I may, yeah. Based on some of my interactions with Sally, and if I can pimp Reason for a second, I did a great podcast with her that's up at reason.com, as well as a video version of the conversation. And in the most recent issue of Reason magazine, there's a very nice transcript and glamour photos of Sally. Not that she needs them. We turned down the glamour so we wouldn't blind our readers.
It was too much.
It's really, but one of the things that I think a lot of drug legalizers, such as myself, often give short shrift to is treatment options. And just as, I want to live in a world where we have many more options for the drugs or the intoxicants we want to take under any circumstances, just as I want to live in a world where the menus at restaurants carry more items rather than fewer, and we're always trying and experimenting and hybridizing and innovating with treatment. And I have a personal experience with family members in the Medicaid system, the Medicaid treatment system in a couple places. It is so awful. I myself find a lot of value in things like the abstinence 12-step style programs and things like that, but which predominate in almost all therapeutic settings. They don't work for everybody, and it would be fantastic if we can live in a world where not only do we have a wider array of substances, foods, experiences that we can intensify and improve our lives with, but also that we have more treatment, and we have more different types of treatment that are widely available to people. And that opens up a whole thing that AEI is great on, about things like occupational licensing and about all kinds of regulations and restrictions. But we, as Sally was saying, we need more experimentation and we need overlapping jurisdictions that are trying, that are carving new paths, I think.
Well, and on that note, thank you all for serving on this wonderful panel. Thanks to our viewers for tuning in, and have a great rest of your day.